Welcome to Troubleshooting Families. My name is Harlan Brum. I'm the Global Technical Lead for Revit Architecture with Autodesk Product Support. In this course, we'll explain the process to troubleshoot a family issue in a Revit product. We'll talk about the best practices of family creation so that you can understand the methods to prevent problems before they occur. First, let's look at some of the problems that typically occur within the family editor while creating content. Constraint errors are a common error that can occur within the family editor environment. These errors occur when placing constraints that sometimes duplicate or replicate another constraint within the family. You will receive a constraints are not satisfied error while creating new content within the family editor. Another type of problem you may experience is a problem loading the family. These can manifest themselves as can't make type errors when loading a new family into the project. The error would say can't make type, and then the name of the family would follow. Third, you may encounter a family display problem. When loading a family into the project, the family will not display correctly. These settings are controlled within the family editor environment, and understanding the family editor environment can further help you refine and understand these three types of problems. Identifying the problem is the first step to take when troubleshooting a family content creation issue. There are a number of questions you should ask when starting to undertake a family issue in order to understand where the problem is occurring. It's important to differentiate between an error that occurs within the family editor or one that occurs when loading the family into a project. Understanding the difference between these errors can help you troubleshoot the problem. An error that occurs within the family editor is often related to the geometry or constraints when flexing the error. When loading into a project, typically these errors are with family display problems or family load issues. Also, it's important to check whether or not objects in the same category look and act correct as the object you're working on. The category of the object makes a big difference in how the family behaves when it's loaded and used inside of a project. Check to make sure that objects in a similar category also are behaving the way you expect. The process to troubleshoot a family inside of a Revit product can be complex. It's often best to understand how the family was created in order to troubleshoot it. Sometimes solving these problems requires recreating the family itself in order to resolve whatever may be happening. Let's look at some steps you can take in order to make this process a little easier. First, it's important to simplify the problem. Eliminate geometry, constraints, dimensions, materials, any items that can complex the problem you want to remove so that you're only dealing with the problem geometry or constraints. Often creating a copy of the original family can help to facilitate this effort. It's important to attempt to work backwards and understand how the family was built in order to ensure that you're recreating the work and understanding where the problem occurs. Make sure that the family is in the correct category. The category of a family is a critically important piece of information that you must understand in order to properly troubleshoot the issue. The next step would be to recreate any constraints that are causing problems. Sometimes the order of creating constraints can be the issue itself. Creating a constraint in the incorrect order can result in errors you don't expect. Next, you can remove parameters from the family itself. Removing parameters and making sure the geometry is behaving as expected can be a key step in understanding how the family was created and how you can resolve the issue. Finally, when dealing with formulas inside of a family, if those formulas are causing problems, you can replace the formulas with real values and make sure the family geometry is working correctly. This will help you understand whether or not the formula itself is causing the problem, the parameter is in the incorrect units, or the geometry that is being driven by the parameter is the actual cause. The process of family troubleshooting involves simplifying the problem, working backwards, making sure the content's in the correct category, and then recreating different areas of the family in order to make sure they were created properly. Let's look at some tips for family troubleshooting. The first is to make sure your family's category is correct. We've talked about this earlier. The family category is a critically important piece to understanding how that family will behave when loaded into a project. A big part of the family's category is its cutability. Whether or not that family can be shown in cut in a plan view or in a section view. There are two types of lines inside of Revit architecture. There are cut lines and projection lines. You can see these when you go to object styles inside a project or a family. The table on the right shows the typical families within Revit architecture, whether or not they can be cut, or whether or not that type of category has an option the user control for the cutability. Take, for example, floors. Floors can be shown as being cut in section, for example. It does not have an option because it's a system family. Take generic models. Generic models can be shown as cut. It does not have an option that the user can control. That means generic model families will always be shown in cut, in section, plan, or elevation even if they're being cut. Take doors as another example. So doors can be cut, but the user has an option to control whether or not certain parts of the geometry are shown in cut or projection. Getting the family in the correct category can help make sure that it displays properly. A good troubleshooting step is to place the family as a generic model category within the project to make sure that it appears correctly, if it needs to be cut. Another tip you can use with certain types of families, like light fixtures, is what we call the invisible line trick. Certain families need to touch the cut plane in order for their projection lines to display. Light fixture is such a family. Light fixtures must touch the cut plane in order to display within a plan view, for example. In order to facilitate this, you can create a model line within the family that goes from the geometry to where the cut plane would be within the project environment. This model line can be turned into an invisible line so that it is not visible within the project. When the family is loaded into the project and that model line touches the cut plane, the projection lines of the geometry will now display in the view. The third tip is around the conceptual modeling tools in Revit 2010 and 2011. The mass families now in Revit use the new conceptual modeling tools. With these tools, it's a great idea and best practice to use reference lines to create your forms. Reference lines are not absorbed into the form when it is created. Model lines will be absorbed into the form. What this means is that if you use model lines to create your forms and you delete the form element itself, the model lines will also be deleted. If, however, you can use reference lines to create the structure of your form, when you delete the form, the reference lines will remain, allowing you to recreate and iterate through the design much easier. Using these tips, you can work to create better content and allow it to be display in the views and ways that you would like. Now, let's take a look at the best practices for family creation. Creating good families is the key to avoiding problems inside the family editor or within a project. First, always start with reference lines when creating a new family. Reference lines form the skeleton of your family, and it's important to make sure the bones are correct before you add the geometry. Start with reference lines, then add your dimensions, add your parameters and your constraints. Make sure that those parameters and constraints work as expected, then add your geometry at the very end. It's important to follow this process as it catches mistakes made in the geometric process and in the process of creating parameters. Do this for each piece of geometry. Don't create all your reference lines, all your parameters at once, and then add all your geometry. Do this for each piece of geometry you're going to be adding to your model. A big part of creating good families is testing. So make sure you flex your family again to make sure that it's working correctly. Use big and small values within the family editor. Values that are way out of scale, too big or way too small, that aren't realistic. This will ensure that your family works under all conditions and that it can't be broken by a user error. Another good best practice is to generate two types within the family simply for testing. Generating these two types, one with values for way too small, one with values that are way too big, will allow you to quickly and easily test the family to make sure that it hits the conditions you need and solves the problems you're trying to solve. Also, it's important to load your family into a project to make sure that it's working there. This is especially important for hosted families like windows or doors or even light fixtures. This will make sure that the family is working properly within the project environment and not just in the family editor. It's a good idea to test this as you're adding geometry to your family, even when you don't have a completed family. Finally, consider limiting the complexity of your family when it's practical. Don't overmodel. By overmodeling, we mean providing too much detail within the family that you could very easily get away with drafting or detailing within the project environment. Keeping your families lightweight allow them to be more flexible, fit other situations, and doesn't overburden your project with unneeded information. If you can detail it, it's a good idea to keep the family simple and lightweight and do your detailing and drafting views within the project environment. Following these best practices will allow you to create content that is both valuable and functional. In this class, we've talked about how to identify a family content issue, the process you need to use for troubleshooting a family, some troubleshooting tips, and finally, the best practices for family creation so that you can avoid any problems. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot in this session.